Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Don't trip on that.
I noticed that the other night.
We should, I'll add that to my to-do list. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet, my name is Lindsay Chervinsky. I am the Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library. Thank you so much for coming to today's Brown Bag. This is very exciting because our guest speaker has been sitting across the hall from me for the last several months, but because I haven't been here a whole lot, I haven't gotten to learn as much about her work as I would like. So I'm thrilled to also be able to be in the audience and learn from her. Before we begin, however, I would like to let you know about a couple of upcoming library programs that we have in the next few weeks. Next week on December 9th, we will have a lunch at the library with author and historian Eli Merritt, who will be discussing his latest book, Disunion Among Ourselves, The Perilous Politics of the American Revolution. The next day, on December 10th, we are hosting a Ford Evening Book Talk with historian Nathan Pearl Rosenthal, who will discuss his book, The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It. And then on December 13th, we will be hosting another Brown Bag lunch with research fellow Ross, I didn't ask how to pronounce his last name, Nettervelt, I'm hoping I got that right, who will be presenting on his topic, The Border Seas of a New British Empire, Security, Imperial Reconstitution, and the British Atlantic Islands in the Age of the American Revolution. But for today's event, allow me to introduce our speaker. Sandra Moats is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. She is the author of 2 previous books on the politics and culture of the early republic, including Navigating Neutrality, Early American Governance in the Turbulent Atlantic. Her current book project focuses on the outsized role U.S. consuls play in conducting American diplomacy from the 1790s to the 1920s. Her project, Global at the Founding, offers a groundbreaking and refreshing perspective on the commercial focus of American diplomacy from the Revolution into the early 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Moats.
First of all, thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to present my research. It's always dangerous to put a historian in front of a live microphone. And also, thank you just for the opportunity to be a fellow again at Mount Vernon. So it's been a wonderful experience. As you can see, I'm playing with book titles. So the latest is Amateurs Abroad. But the theme of my talk is still pretty much the same. The idea of U.S. consuls in not just the early republic, but all the way into the 20th century. Okay, so as Lindsay just said, this is a little bit of product placement on my part. These are my 2 previous books. But there is a theme and a thread here, and the idea is my fundamental interest is once the Constitution is drafted and written, how do you translate its abstract principles, its ideas into practice? How do you launch a government based on these concepts? My first book was on presidential ceremony. The second one was much more engaged with government and institutional, we want to be neutral, but you also have to have a government to support that. The neutrality book helped me kind of get exposed to the topic of consuls, because as I was studying neutrality and ship violations and things like that, I came across the U.S. consuls and the consular service. Most of us who've traveled abroad know what the consuls are and the consulates are. They're the folks, if you get in trouble, you lose your passport, you get robbed, you get into some kind of trouble, they're the folks you go and talk to, as opposed to political diplomats who are there to conduct foreign policy. And that's basically true with the consuls that we have in the early republic, but there are also some real significant differences. One of the things that really stood out to me when I started working on this project is the fact that the United States put so much emphasis on having consuls across the globe. There were approximately 3,000 consuls in the period from 1781 to 1924. And this is from the State Department website, compared to 421 political diplomats. And some of that, well, okay, they're more consulates, right? There are going to be more people. There are high turnover. People stay in these jobs a couple of years. Nonetheless, I don't do math, but you can see that this is still a significant difference where the US government's putting its emphasis in terms of diplomacy prior to the 20th century, and that this is a very intentional pattern, and we'll talk about that more. Something else that stood out, and again, this is from the State Department website. So in the time that we have two ministers, so in 1790, we have essentially a minister in Paris and a minister in London. That's who the two would be. At the same time, we have 10 consular posts across the globe. And we even have somebody in China in 1790. And you can see as time goes on, the numbers slowly increasing the number of diplomatic posts, but you're seeing a huge increase in the number of consular posts. So even if you account for turnover, these are actual positions. These numbers aren't individuals. They're the actual physical roles. You can see the height by 1890, 323, and then it slowly starts declining. And at the same time, you see the number of diplomatic posts finally increasing. Couple of things to know about this: both the diplomatic posts and the consular posts I'm talking about have to go through Senate approval. So these are folks who are nominated by the president, and they have to go through Senate approval. Over time, of course, the State Department will have staff people, clerks, other people who don't need Senate approval. What I'm comparing here are people who get nominated by the president and then get Senate approval and then receive a commission and are sent out in the posting. And again, you can see just the numerical imbalance and again, what the United States diplomatic priorities are. Another way of looking at this, if you are a visual learner, is where they're posted. So this is 1790. You have, as I mentioned, a minister in Paris and a minister in London. All of these other postings in the 1790s are consulars. So I already mentioned there's one in China, there's one in India, I think that's in Bombay, the Caribbean, obviously, it's a lot going on in Europe, and also in North Africa. So where we have consuls, we don't necessarily have diplomats, okay? Like I said, we only have the two ministers who are in Paris and London. Something else, just to highlight this slide, not surprisingly, our first early concentration of consuls is in France and England. And that makes sense because they're our principal trading partners. And so you can see they are all over, not just in London and Paris, which you'd expect, but they're along the coast, they're in the south there. And again, any place where ship captains might be showing up, where we might have commercial interests, that's where you're going to find consuls posted. As I mentioned before, the numbers are expanding, but also the geographical reach is expanding. So by the 18 teens, we have a consul in South America. They're starting to expand even more in the Caribbean, also in Asia. So again, not only are the numbers growing, the geographical reach is expanding. These are not easy places to get to. I mean, we have one you can see in Jakarta. And to imagine sending somebody out there in these postings, that these are not easy places to go to, and we sort of say, oh, and by the way, help out any American you run into while you're out there. Okay, again, the map keeps growing, expanding. Again, not just in Europe, but in Asia. You're starting to see in Australia, South Africa, on the continental North America, Mexico, Canada. Again, the point of this is just to give you a sense of the geographical reach of the consular service. Again, not just numerically, but also we are sending folks all over the world. The two at the very far end there, those are the Society Islands, Tahiti, places like that. Again, you have a couple of postings in Australia. We've expanded into Africa. Really a pretty strong representation in Asia at this time. And of course, Japan finally opens up in the 1850s. And the consular service follows that pattern. So what are these consuls and where did they come from? They get their start, at least for the present day United States, in our treaty with France, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. So there are two revolutionary treaties. One is the Treaty of Alliance. That's the one that gets France into the American Revolution. The second one is a trade treaty, a free trade. And what the United States wanted all along was they just thought, well, if we just give everyone our free trade and give them our raw materials, they'll be our best friends. And of course, that wasn't necessarily the case. But the Treaty of Amity and Commerce basically becomes a template for American foreign policy for the next 100 years or so. And the United States will negotiate at least 10 or 12 treaties all over the world, these treaties of amity and commerce. So the Treaty of Alliance is a short term, get us through the revolution, get us the military help we need. We abandon that approach after the war is over and focus on free trade, access to markets, raw materials, all of that. Again, Section 29 of the 1778 treaty contains a provision on consuls, permitting each country to post folks in the respective countries. And as I said before, this becomes a template not only for future treaties, but American foreign policy over the next 100 or so years. Thomas Barclay is the first consul appointed. He is appointed to Paris. One of the issues that Franklin and Adams run into when they're trying to do diplomacy in Paris during the revolution is you have a lot of ship captains and sailors who keep having problems. And so finally, Franklin's like, can you please send someone to help manage this? Because we're not getting anything else done. And so Barclay will be the first of many who get appointed to these positions to help out American seamen and also to help facilitate maritime commerce. As part of the aftermath of the revolution, and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce says there'll be a consular agreement where we formally lay out how this is going to work between the two countries. Interestingly, the one that Franklin tries to negotiate turns out to be surprisingly contentious. The French see consuls as essentially civil servants, people who come here, have the guise of a government employee, whereas the Americans see these consuls as business people. And so there's contention over that. There's also fear on the American side that the France is going to be kind of getting into our business and kind of keeping an eye on us, especially as we do business in the Caribbean and the West Indies. And so, believe it or not, the Continental Congress says, no, this is not acceptable. They push back, and the consular agreement has to wait. Jefferson, this is Thomas Jefferson, as he looked when he was minister to France, he actually negotiates the consular agreement and gets it ratified in 1788. And as luck would have it, he, of course, comes back to the United States to be the first Secretary of State, and he gets to help implement it. And also, just for the people who are interested, the consular agreement with France will be our first diplomatic agreement under the new Constitution, which I think is not just trivia, but it's important because it shows the direction that American foreign policy wants to go. Okay, just because I can't say the word consul enough, the consular service also, not only does it show up in a diplomatic agreement, but it also shows up in the Constitution. Okay, so there are different vehicles, different institutional structures supporting this. So you can see this is Article 2 of the Constitution. That's, of course, the one that deals with the executive branch. It's included in the list of appointments the president has. And to me, again, that suggests that this is significant and prominent enough that they're going to put that in. Because you could just say "and other public ministers" and leave it at that, but that they actually highlight the word consuls and to show that this is going to be important to our story and American foreign policy. All right, and one more. Finally, with the ratification of the consular agreement, the United States passes its own Consular Act, and this lays out what consuls will do. One role is to monitor shipping traffic going in and out of ports, which you can imagine is a little bit like herding cats. You're sort of at the mercy of kind of keeping an eye on the ship traffic, keeping an eye on who's coming and going. Are they talking to you? Are they being forthcoming? All of that. Like many things, people tend to find the consuls when they get in trouble. When the ship captain runs aground, he's got stranded seamen, he's got seamen who aren't on the right boat. And so a big job of the consuls is to help these stranded sailors, get them home, feed them and clothe them, literally, and house them until a boat shows up that's willing to take them back. And, if you're in Paris or London, it's probably pretty easy to get a ship back to the United States. If you're in Jakarta, South Africa, some of these more remote locations, it may take a while to get these American sailors home. The consuls also end up incurring the expense, at least short term, for the feeding, clothing, housing of these stranded sailors. And lastly, they're supposed to receive protests and declarations. I haven't really found any what that specifically is. And then lastly, if a ship captain dies or a sailor dies in your port, you're responsible for helping settle that person's estate and try to get their remains home and all of that. So it's quite it's almost like a social worker sort of job. You're dealing with a lot of problems and emergencies that just kind of land in your lap. So who are these guys? Well, they're American citizens, but not always. Many of our consuls are actually foreigners already living in a port who come well recommended, and we put them because we need somebody to do the job. The ideal is that somebody who's well connected, well respected, independently wealthy, because we're not paying these guys anything, at least not in the first 30, 40 years. Except if you're in the Barbary States, because those guys have their hands full with negotiations and war and all that kind of stuff. They're the only ones who get paid. So the idea is that you be a self-supporting businessman, you're well connected, you can help out the occasional sailor or ship captain when they get stuck or need help, but your daytime job is something else. This is Joshua Johnson. He will be John Quincy Adams' future father-in-law. He sort of fits the mold, but he also has a pretty good assignment. He's in London. That's a nice place to be. He's a businessman. He's successful. He's an American citizen. All of that. Not everybody fits this model, and not everyone is being put in a situation where they're going to be successful. So how are they chosen? Well, this will give you a sense of it's a little bit all over the place. You'll get letters. I've run into them, people writing to the Secretary of State at the time saying, you could really use a consul in X, and I may be the person for the job. So you'll get a lot of letters like that. Not always are they successful in getting appointed, but you'll have people saying, hey, there's a lot of business going on here. There's a lot of Americans. You might think about putting a consul. And of course, if you read any letters of the early republic, the early presidencies, lots of people are looking for jobs in this period, government jobs. Political connections. This is William Knox. He's the brother of Henry Knox, the Secretary of War. He gets appointed to Dublin. You should sense that this guy's maybe a little unsettled. He actually has a nervous breakdown and ends up in a mental hospital and dies there, comes home, and so just had a hard life. Martha Washington's nephew ends up being a consul in Hispaniola. A lot of times you have businessmen who are already abroad, they're well connected, or they're people engaged in shipping, typically coming out of Massachusetts or New York, and have some experience and think, yeah, okay, I'll go back to Amsterdam. I know people, I can do the job. You also might have younger sons from families like that, people who are in the merchant business, in the shipping business, and their sons are looking for a chance to move forward in the world. And so they'll apply to be consuls, and their fathers will write letters and saying, my son, you would like to do this, and you should think of it. And many do get appointed based on that. And then lastly, people inherit the post. So if you're a family, your father was in, Lisbon, and maybe you'll live there, and you might become the next consul when he dies, and then your grandson, and so on. There's an English family who actually holds the consular position in Falmouth for over 100 years. They just keep passing it down. So as you can see, it's kind of random where people are coming from. What you're not seeing is college education required. You have to pass a test. You have to show an ability in world affairs. That's not really what's going on here. And you'll see that that sort of leads to some issues. So you want to become a consul. Well, like I said before, the president nominates you, sends your name to Congress or to the Senate, and the Senate approves you. Most of the vetting occurs at the presidential side, at least that I can tell. And they're very explicit if you read the letters. I mean, there's one that Jefferson writes evaluations of the various guys, and he's like, yeah, he's a drunk and he's lazy. Let's not send him up. I mean, these are just like these notes they put. So far, I haven't seen any examples where the Senate has rejected anyone, at least in the early republic. So most of the vetting occurs at like I said, at the presidential side, and in all of the different ways I showed in the previous slide, that people self-nominate, people are recommended, people are well-connected, all of these kind of things. Aside from the fact that you don't get paid, you're actually required to post a $2,000 bond. That's in 1790 money. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of I mean, that's a lot of money today, and as high as 10,000. And the idea is that you'll perform the job faithfully. So you're kind of thinking, why would anyone do this? You're not getting paid, and you're also having to put money up. And then finally you get, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this correctly, but you get a exequatur, I think is how you say it. And that is basically your letter to go and be a diplomatic representative for the United States. And if the country you're in doesn't accept that letter, you can't do business. And that's something that many of these folks run into. Okay, so the individual on the top here, that's Samuel Shaw. He's of the famous Shaw family. If you've ever seen Glory, it's a famous family out of Massachusetts, out of Boston. He's actually one of our first consuls. He's appointed to Canton, China in 1786. That's pretty impressive. Canton is now Guangzhou, if you care about this. This is more kind of for ha-has. This is James Fenimore Cooper of the Last of the Mohicans fame. He was actually a consul in Lyon, France. He was appointed when John Quincy Adams was president. He was not paid at the time, but he wanted to kind of raise his literary reputation in Europe and thought, well, I'll hang out in France for 2 years. And so, again, you should be getting a sense that these consuls are coming from a lot of different places, a lot of different qualifications, abilities, reasons they're there, all of that. Here are a couple of other ones that I've just picked up along the way. This is that Nathaniel Hawthorne of the Scarlet Letter. He's doing this for money. By the time he's a consul, they're actually getting paid. They're getting salaried. He's somebody who picked up jobs all over the place. He worked in the customs house and things like that. This gentleman, James Weldon Johnson, who's a writer. If you know the Black National Anthem, "Lift Every Voice and Sing," he wrote that. So these are people who get picked up in the consular service for various reasons and various backgrounds. Okay. Interestingly, I have Napoleon on the slide because I want to talk about all the turmoil going on at the time. But interestingly, he's actually considered the first consul of France. That's his official title when he comes into power before he becomes emperor. Because he's the first consul, we have to call all of our consuls in France commercial agents because they believe there's only one consul. So that's a little side note here. And again, Napoleon is always like the biggest personality in the room and continues to be. So what are some of the issues you're going to encounter if you're a consul across the globe? Well, of course, British impressment of American sailors is just very prevalent, very problematic. So much so that many American sailors don't want to identify themselves to the consuls that they're American citizens because they don't want to blow their own cover. They want to kind of just move into a port city and keep a low profile. So consuls actually have a hard time even identifying who these folks are. They're trying to keep their identity sort of hidden to not run into trouble. Privateering, French privateering of American ships. The way I think of it is Britain needs the naval personnel and France needs the ship. And so these are the kind of the harassments going on to American shipping. At this time, 1790s into the early 1800s, we're at war with various Barbary states in North Africa. And so that's a big issue and a big area of contention. And then, of course, and the Napoleonic Wars going across in the early 19th century across Europe and North Africa. So if you're a consul in this period, you've got a lot on your plate, particularly depending on where you're posted. Um, so why are we doing this? Why did the United States focus on this? Well, as Washington famously says, steer clear of permanent alliances. We want our foreign policy, at least early on, to be about free trade, about economics. We don't want to be in warfare. We don't want to be getting tangled up in European affairs and things like that. We want trade to be our calling card, and that's how we want to interact with the world. And we see the consuls as a way of protecting and promoting our commercial interests. It's cost effective. We're not paying these people, okay? If you know William McClay, he was one of the early senators. He wrote this great diary where he writes all these comments. And there was a proposal early on to pay the consuls. And he's like, we don't have to pay those guys. He's like, this shouldn't cost us any more money. So it's very cost effective. Something else that I've thought about is when you think about the big diplomatic agreements of the time, whether it's the purchase of Louisiana, the Jay Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, they're done by special envoys. They're not done by the permanent diplomat who's in the city, okay? Because again, we just want that person there kind of keeping the paperwork moving. We don't want them to have a big responsibility like their European counterparts. And then lastly, it's a way for us to save money because we don't have to throw lavish parties. We don't have to have the entertainments. We don't have to have the carriages, all of the things you have to have if you're in a European court. We intentionally call our diplomats ministers. So, because if you're an ambassador, that means that you have to have a certain size staff, certain number of entertainments, parties to keep up at that rank. And as I've written on the slide, our very first ambassador isn't until 1893. Okay, so that gives you some idea how little attention we're paying to the diplomatic side of the house and how much energy we're putting onto the commercial and consular side. Okay, obviously the consular service, for all its ambitions, is going to have problems. If you don't pay people to do a job, it's hard to kind of have them be accountable and responsible. You also have folks posted all over the world, and it's hard to stay in touch with them. And the dedication to professionalism, duty, experience, background, accountability varies widely, okay? Some are very good and very conscientious. Some are not. Some walk off the post and don't tell anyone. And you only find out later that someone will be like, oh, you don't have a consul there anymore. We only find that out after the fact. Obviously, it's very difficult to communicate, especially in these more far-flung areas. Some of the consuls will take the position and then change their mind before even taking the post. So very high turnover, just all the things you can imagine. The lack of resources, as I mentioned, the salary is probably the single biggest complaint of the consuls. And many of them are constantly writing letters like, when are we going to get paid? When will we get a salary? Will Congress pass a bill? And the answer is no, not for a while. The other problem is a lot of the times when they're aiding the sailors, it's coming out of their pocket. And Congress finally appropriates money to at least reimburse them for those things. You're sticking people in difficult situations without a lot of support, especially in these more remote areas. You may be posted to places where they're not going to accept your credentials, and you're just going to have to come home or hang out there and hope someone accepts your credentials. Catherine the Great, we posted consul fairly early to St. Petersburg, and she says, I haven't decided I think the United States is independent yet, so I'm not going to accept the consul. So the guy's got to come home. What are you going to do? And like I mentioned before, maritime citizens who want to fly under the radar and don't want to draw attention themselves. This gentleman here is a man named James Greenleaf, who you probably have encountered. He owned a lot of the land that becomes Washington, D.C. He's a land speculator. He's a little bit of a crook. He's not maybe the most honest, savory person. He actually applies to be a consul to Amsterdam because people are starting to catch on to the fact that he's not maybe the most ethical businessman, and he wants to get out of town before people figure it out. So for a couple of years, he's our consul to Amsterdam. Of course, and he even marries a Dutch woman. Like he's like, I'm going to just get myself out of the way and kind of hope no one notices I'm gone. a year or two later, all his troubles catch up with him. He's arrested. He's brought back to the United States. He ends up in a debtor's prison. So again, not all the motives for becoming a consul are savory or generous or altruistic. And he's an example of someone who's kind of going in with his own agenda. All right. So what am I working on? Well, obviously presidential papers, diplomatic papers, congressional acts, what people tend to kind of go the high end of history, the elite end, if you will. So as I sit outside of Lindsay's office, you wonder, what am I doing in there? A lot of it are Secretary of State records, presidential papers, things like that. The other thing I've started working on is a 3,000 person database of these folks. I've probably identified 600 to 700. I don't know if I'm going to get to all 3,000. The whole point of this is to try to get the stories, try to get the thick description, of, as Clifford Geertz would say, of these people to find out what's really going on the ground. So my time at Mount Vernon has been a mixture of the official and then the unofficial, and just learning the stories and the anecdotes and the biographies of why they're there. As I come to realize that the sailors are maybe not as cooperative with the consuls as you might hope, I think if I can find any first-person accounts, letters, this will be probably the most challenging, of course, because a lot of these documents don't survive. But again, to see what does this consular service look like from the other side, from the perspective of someone who's just trying to be a maritime citizen. After I leave Mount Vernon, I will head to the National Archives. So a lot of the stuff I'm working with right now is early Republic. It's in the Madison, Jefferson, Washington papers. But once you get, past the 1825, 1830, you're going to be in the State Department papers, the State Department records. And so that will take me to College Park and the National Archives. So where do we go from here? This is my last slide. So if you're like, oh, thank God. I think the first and foremost is just what a huge part the consular service was in the first century of the United States. That it's not the pinstripe diplomats of the 20th century. It's not the Cold War diplomats. It's not the peace treaties and all those things that we think about of 20th century diplomacy. It's a foreign policy based in economics, based in commerce, based in unofficial, official, but non-professional diplomatic corps that are comprised of consuls. And the reason the end date for my project is 1924 is after decades of complaints, problems, malfeasance, misbehavior, every kind of problem you can have with the consular service, the United States government finally decides to unify the two halves of the State Department into one entity, the U.S. Foreign Service. And that's under the Rogers Act in 1924. And so that's when we'll finally start getting what we're accustomed to as the modern day Foreign Service. People were required to take exams, show that they're qualified. This also obviously coincides with the other civil service reforms going on at the time. But again, for at least 60, 70 years, the consular service was the face of American diplomacy. And this idea of the American century or the Cold War diplomacy, it's a much later story and it's a much shorter story. And again, all you need to do is go back to Adams's model treaty from the revolutionary diplomacy and Washington's admonition to steer clear of permanent alliances. And you can see why you get such a dominant, why these consuls, for all their problems, end up being such a dominant force in American foreign policy prior to the 20th century. Okay. I'll stop talking, and if there are any questions, I'd happily answer them. So
I will wait for very loud. I can turn.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have tons of questions, but I'm only going to give you 3. First, in one of your early slides, you referred to, I believe, the political diplomats and the consuls being something else. I'd be interested where you got the term political diplomat from.
That's what they called them at the time. So like if we could beam up Franklin right now, he would say political diplomat, people who deal with the treaties and negotiations and things like that. That's how they separate the two early on.
Okay.
So.
And then, until about mid 1800s, they weren't paid. Was there a problem of corruption?
Absolutely. I mean, and I haven't gotten into it, but there has to be, right? Because you're sending people out there, you're telling them to do all this work. I mean, because it sort of does, it's a scheme that doesn't make sense, because how would you not have corruption? I think the idea is that they kind of thought, well, either you'd be independently wealthy and you'd be doing this out of altruism, or it might open up business opportunities, or maybe somebody might tip you for your help. These are stranded sailors who have they literally barely have the shirt on their back. So it's a very ill-conceived thing. So absolutely, you're going to have corruption. A lot of times too, the consuls they're doing a lot of buying and selling and trading, and it's like, whose interest are they protecting? Their own, the U.S. government. They're also shipping a lot of wine to our founding fathers. So Madison, Jefferson, all of them. Even Washington. He's like, oh, the case of Madeira is on its way. So yeah, there's absolutely opportunity for corruption. Yeah.
Okay. And my last question before I turn it over to someone else. In our Rogers Act Foreign Service, we have consular officers and we also have honorary consuls.
Mm-hmm.
Was there such a concept as an honorary consul, or because it sort of sounds to me like what was going on then was pretty much a combination of the two?
Yeah, and I haven't run into that, but again, I'm only focused so far. I've just focused on the 1790 to about 1830. I think once I get into the National Archives, State Department records, I'll probably see more of that. But like when you have folks like James Fenimore Cooper or Nathaniel Hawthorne, they are the authorized consul. It's that they're the guy in charge, even though you think, oh, well, they're kind of a celebrity. But yeah, I think that comes later. So
Did they get diplomatic immunity in the sense we have today?
that's a good question. I don't think so. I don't think that exists yet. So yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I've run into a few of these people, not surprisingly, given what I've written about. And some of them were really crucial source of information. I think Daniel Clark in New Orleans, all during the period of the Mississippi crisis. I mean, he is telling the administration in Washington what to worry about, what's going on. So it seems to me that in places where there is no minister, sometimes they do some political work, even if they can't negotiate treaties, right? They're not negotiating treaties, but they're doing the kinds of work that like a charge d'affaires could do, but they don't have a charge because they don't have a minister, because they don't actually have an official diplomatic posting. Are you seeing that at some of these far-flung places, that they're like, you get out to Batavia and you're the one guy, and if there's anything that comes up, you got to do it?
Absolutely. And I think especially the hotter the spot, the more likely they're going to end up playing these diplomatic roles. Keep in mind, 1790s, early 1800s, you have the Haitian Revolution going on. So you have folks there. North Africa is very much a hot spot. One of the guys, his name's James Leander Cathcart. He was actually a prisoner of the Algerian pirates, I think. He helps negotiate the freedom for himself and 19 others, and he becomes named consul, which I almost put that and I thought, okay, this is getting a little in the weeds. So this is a guy who's playing not only, yeah, so absolutely, you're ending up playing, because again, by relying so heavily on the consuls and neglecting traditional diplomats or political diplomats, you're creating this vacuum, because you're assuming all the issues are going to be economic. And that's just not going to be the case, especially if situations are hot. And when the Napoleonic Wars are going on, people are reporting back about that, as, Charlene nodding very vigorously, because these are your people on the ground. These are your eyes and ears. And so even though you're saying, oh, you're businessmen and you're going to help out sailors, you're absolutely going to get thrust into that situation, because who else do you have to get this information from? And certainly when I write the book, which that will be something for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to sort of simplify that, but that you're absolutely correct about that they get thrust into situations. And then you wonder, do they even have the training, the background, the qualifications to be doing this? So, and where are their interests, and where are they coming at? So, okay.
For the early consuls, did they have any designation on their prior to the establishment of diplomatic passports?
I haven't run into any.
Travel. I don't even know what to press. For the early consuls, was there any designation on their passports that they had special status prior to the establishment in 1924 of a diplomatic passport?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I don't have an answer to. Other than the letter of exequatur that they'll have with them, I don't, I don't know. And I don't know enough about early, obviously passports don't look like ours do because they don't have photographs on them. So I don't know enough about to know that, but that's something as I figure out the business of how this consular service worked. The other sense you should get is they're kind of figuring this out as they go. So by the 1830s, they realized, okay, unsalaried consuls isn't working. We've got to pass legislation to fix that. Not giving them any money to help stranded ship captains. We've got to pass legislation to authorize that. So it's like they're making it up as they go. And I think once I get into the National Archive records, I think I'm going to find things much more much more formalized. That's the word I'm looking for, and much more sort of by the book, rules and regulations laid out in a way that they're kind of making this up as they go along. One of the documents I keep running across are these circulars that the secretaries of state, and they're essentially like, do this, don't do that. They really are figuring this out as they go. And keep in mind, the State Department is a tiny entity at this point as well. So you've got these folks all over the globe at very levels of commitment and professionalism and all that, and you're trying to somehow manage all of that. So, but I will keep that in mind, and I'll look out for that in my research.
Do you know when military attaches came into the picture?
Military,
Attaches.
I don't. And again, I think that's something that's going to come later. I mean, it really is how bare bones they're keeping this. It's just sort of extraordinary. And that was kind of my entry into this topic. It's like, why is it? I mean, just to go back to this, I'm not a numbers person, and even I'm like, whoa, this is so lopsided. So I don't think you have a lot of extra folk, and I think they're going to come again late 19th century. So, but that's something I need to explore more as the State Department starts becoming what we think of as the State Department. So, other questions? Yeah.
Yes, I have two quick questions. The gentleman from the early 20th century, I think he was the consul to Venezuela. Was he the first African American consul?
Oh, James Weldon Johnson? I don't think he was. I think there was earlier ones around the Civil War and after the Civil War. Because keep in mind, the Republican Party is the party of African Americans, and so they could have potentially appointed, just like Frederick Douglass enjoyed, he was served in various federal jobs. I don't think James Weldon Johnson is. That's a great question. I think they had, after Lincoln, I think you had African Americans get appointed. That's something I have to double check. There's only, if you're also curious, in this period prior to 1924, there's only one woman consul, and she takes the place of her husband who dies and does it very temporarily. So,
Well, that was my next question.
yeah,
And what is this woman's name?
I'd have to go back into my notes and see, but yeah, her husband. It's kind of like when back in the day when a congressman or senator would die and then his wife fills the post. But because they're also more remotely located too. It's just okay. You just stay there and do it till we can bring somebody else in.
Do you remember where she was posted?
I'd have to go back. I've got this crazy book. It looks like for those of us who remember what a phone book looks like. It's about this thick, and it's a directory of all of the consuls. And it's like my, it's my Rosetta Stone. It's my curse. And so that a lot of this detail and story come from that. So.
To answer her question based on Google. Okay, based on Google, according to historical records, William Alexander Leidsdorf was the first Black American consul appointed as a vice consul in Yerba Buena, now San Francisco, in 1845 by the U.S. consul in Monterey. And it also then goes on to say Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett, 1869 to 1877, was acknowledged as the very first African American to serve as a U.S. diplomat.
Yeah. So yeah, and that fits, and that kind of matches the history and story. By the way, to go back to our friend Nathaniel Hawthorne, he was a classmate of Franklin Pierce. They went to Bowdoin together, and that's how he got got the job. So
We've got a question up here.
Yeah, the immunity question is resolved in 1961 with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. There was various levels of immunity throughout history, but it becomes formalized internationally in 1961. And the consuls do have different immunities than the accredited diplomats do. But my question was, when you're researching a consular post and who was in that post, let's say 1800 in Naples or in Tripoli, where are the records?
that's a really good question, because again, if the consuls are disappearing and wandering off the job, where's all the paperwork going? A lot of this is so at this point, a lot of what I'm dealing with is the stuff that is the stuff that's coming from, well, Philadelphia and then Washington, D.C., the stuff from Madison and Jefferson, the official things. And then I'm learning about who the consuls are based on those records, so the presidential papers and things like that. But then when you get into the kind of stuff the National Archives would keep, how much of that has really survived? Probably very little. And then also, obviously later in our history, we get better about keeping track and records and things like that. You're in a cold posting, you got all this paperwork from Washington, D.C., you're going to use that to warm yourself up. You're not going to be hanging on to papers. So thank goodness the early founding era presidential papers are wonderful and they're great to work in. But in terms of getting the story from the other side, that becomes much more challenging. And I think they become better at document keeping 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. There's certainly a lot of reports that are written. I haven't gotten into them, but State Department reports detailing all the problems and troubles and things, and going back to James' question, or the question about corruption, things like that, that try to target that. Again, those we have because they're coming from Washington, D.C. What's coming from the other end? It all depends on the consul. It all depends on what survives, what passes down. Ship travel is very challenging in this period. So you do end up with somewhat of a one-sided story. So.
You may wish at some point in this project that there's very little documentation, but I spent a summer in grad school moving all of the microfilms from one room of the University of Virginia's research library to another room. And there are, even there, much less at the National Archives, there are hundreds of reels of microfilm. Consul from Batavia, consul in Bordeaux, consul in all of these things, all in the National Archives, right? All the stuff coming into DC. Now, how much of it is stuff that was actually kept in Bordeaux or wherever? I have no idea. I didn't delve into them except for New Orleans, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, my halcyon time at Mount Vernon is going to end when I end up in the National Archives in microfilm, which is such a joy to work with. And so you'll see me, I'll probably go blind in the process. But that is, I can tell the story. Yeah, I can tell the story of the earlier republic with presidential papers and things like that. But once I get into the later story, it's got to be the State Department records. You're just not going to have, because again, the State Department's not a complex thing in this period. Jefferson and Madison are writing all the letters and memos and things like that. That's going to change in a decade or two once I get into the 1830s up until, the next 100 years of this is going to be very challenging. So. But thanks for that, James.
Hi there.
Hi.
Can you go back to the slide of your chapters?
Oh, sure. Okay. And this is sort of a work in progress. I thought I had 6 chapters, and somehow I only came up with 5 when I was putting this together.
So my sense is it's a little ambitious.
Yeah, I may be trying to pack too much in. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 reflect the fact that I haven't really gotten there yet.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I think when you get to the archives, you're going to be astonished at how much you find. So my question was, how do you intend to sort of frame the narrative of the chapter? Will you maybe focus on immigration for, the latter part of the 19th century? And so I guess I would advise to kind of think of big topics,
Mhm.
you know, because you're going to see so many of those consuls. So you're going to have to think geographically, but, you know, like the bigger issue going on during that time period.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I think at least obviously the 1 and 2, which is what essentially I'll start working on once my fellowship ends. Um, it's the story of the origins and the launching and all of that, and then getting some of the detail and the anecdote. A lot of the consular history becomes, it's a lot of reports and it's a lot of legislation trying to fix things. And then, of course, when you get what would be chapter 4, that also then coincides with what's going on across the government. So for the time being, it's certainly the political and institutional issues that interest me. But you know, the joy of being a historian is the documents tell us a story, and they might tell us something we didn't know or didn't expect. So you know, yeah, I realize this is very ambitious, but it was also a way of saying, well, what is this? What is it going to look like?
Yeah, I understand. I would also encourage you, because I know that this is not something that has been discussed in scholarship, is looking at the Middle East. Those early consuls to Oman, for instance, there's a lot of really interesting history there. Most of the work that's been done is really Eurocentric.
Mhm.
And I think it's time to center
Oh,
places like
absolutely.
North Africa and the Middle East. And because I think that there's also been a lot of work done on what you just said, because it's readily available. So,
Right.
you
Well,
know,
also-
and I say that because I really could use someone to do that research.
You're waiting for that
To
book
help
to
me.
come out.
So I'm just saying, like, where I've seen gaps in the research, that would be great when your book comes out to read it. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully people will still be alive and around and want to read my book. I think it's important. For me, I absolutely agree about. I mean, certainly North Africa gets a lot of print because of the war and all the negotiations and stuff that are going, the Barbary wars and all that. But I'm just struck by this isn't quite the right slide. How far we get into Asia pretty early on. I mean, we're in Burma. We're in multiple places in India. We're in, you know, Jakarta came up. We're once Japan opens up, we're there. We're in multiple places in China. I mean, so there's a lot of stories. This does go back to like how many of the sources survive and how many of these sources. I mean, things become Eurocentric because that's where the documents are kept. You know, you're going to have the stuff from London and Paris because those are also you know, missions or embassies there. But certainly there's a lot of stories to tell. You know, do I want to write a 10-volume encyclopedia on consuls? I don't know. I don't think so. You know, so it's like, do I tell my story and let someone come in and tell like a more of a regional story? I mean, certainly there are recent books, and the historiography on the consuls is very, very weak. One of my secondary sources was from 1898. There are a couple of books more recent, but what they've done is they've taken that regional approach. There's one on Italy that actually Mount Vernon owns, and they've approached it regionally to tell a story about that region through the consuls. I may come to regret this, but I'm interested in the overall sort of the institutional and political system, and so that's kind of story I want to tell while still telling all these smaller stories. So I don't, you know, who knows? Yeah.
And then we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay. I'm a retired U.S. diplomat, so I would welcome you writing 10 volumes, but that's just an aside. Just a comment for the gentleman who was asking about diplomatic passports. I think that would be very interesting, but it's also important to keep in mind with illiteracy being an issue, depending on where you are in the world, having a document can be meaningless. And I know this from personal experience when I was in Somalia, where the literacy rate was less than 1%. And so I had this nice piece of paper that said I was a diplomat and give me all sorts of rights. And when I would show this to the police or the military, whatever, it didn't mean anything to them at all. But then the question, this is very interesting about how the U.S. did it. Have you looked at all at how other countries did it and how we compare? And I don't expect you to have done it for every single country, but do you have any insights, for example, how this would compare with other countries of the time period?
You've just articulated my greatest fear with this project, which someone will ask me, well, what about the consuls from abroad post to the United States? That's my greatest fear with this project. Because I really want to tell the American side, in part because I'm not sure I have the skills to tell. I mean, certainly we have consuls posted up and down the Atlantic seaboard. As soon as France gets permission, they send tons of consuls over during the American Revolution. A lot of the controversy, if you know Citizen Genet, those are consuls, and they're getting involved in the privateering and all of that. I don't want to tell that story. I want to tell, because this project is already huge, but certainly that's, if anyone here has graduate students, that's a dissertation topic for them, because there's a lot going on, especially in this early Republic period, because they end up exercising a lot of the France's foreign policy, and they end up having responsibilities way bigger than they should, because the United States is trying to figure out how to do stuff. I think one of the things, and I'll end with this, is that we're used to a big, large U.S. government where we have ID badges and social security numbers and passports and all this stuff. None of that stuff existed in this period. We're used to having this big federal government and I think as I tell the story, I've got to keep reminding my readers of that. That even, ship identification and passports and things like that, all it would say is 6 foot tall guy, 180 pounds, might have a scar on his cheek. That's what an ID looks like back then. I mean, so that we're not, it's not like a, government issued ID or a badge or whatever, that we have, multiple things like that. And I think, again, this, as I said before, this is a work in progress. They're figuring this out as they go, and what's working and what's not working. And it turns out a lot of it isn't working the way they had planned.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Hmm.